It's a problem in which we have to come up with a movement solution. And so from a very young age, I want young kids to have to problem solve with movement more than I want to teach them exactly what to do. Right. So my goal is to put them in as many situations as possible where I give them a task that maybe is a little bit more open ended or a little bit more competitive or a little bit more problem solving in nature, and I get them to have to figure out what the best solution is. And maybe they lose or maybe they fail that rep or whatever it is, but just through that, the learning motor system then is like, oh, okay, that didn't work. I'm going to try something different this time, even at a subconscious level. And all of a sudden now they begin to self-organize movement because we know they have all the degrees of freedom in the world, right? Most young kids are not going to have restrictions in their movement capabilities, but they need to learn to coordinate their body more effectively to be successful in these tasks.
Welcome to the Upside Strength Podcast, your number one resource for all things fitness and performance in Switzerland. Today I'm chatting with Justin Moore, Master Educator and Head Performance Coach at Parabolic Performance and Rehab. Justin has worked with athletes of all ages and abilities, from 8 years old to professional football players in the National Football League and Olympic-level ice skaters and ice dancers. He's best known for helping elite college football players prepare for the NFL Combine and for their pro days, specializing in improving speed, power, and sprinting mechanics. Justin, thanks for taking the time out of your day to chat, bud.
Man, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And as I said before we hopped on, like we've been talking back and forth through social media for years, so it's good to finally like talk face to face a little bit. So thanks for having me.
Exactly. It's a great pleasure, man. Can you start by telling us about your background and journey as an athlete and then as a coach? How did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so I started, I played sports growing up in just about every way. Like my parents put me in soccer, baseball, I wrestled a little bit, I played basketball. So I had a wide variety of athletic experience, and that was something that was always really important to them. But once I got a little bit older, I started specializing in American football, and that was kind of the game that I was kind of built for that. And I started realizing when I was getting like red cards and yellow cards in soccer that this was not really going to be my sport. So I went to a game where basically they told me like go hit as many people as possible. So I got to football and I played through high school, got pretty good at it, and ended up getting an opportunity to play in college, and got some scholarship money to go to school and get my education, which was really cool. But I kind of ran into something my freshman year that changed everything for me. So I had kind of gotten a little bit too big for my britches. Like I thought I was like this awesome talent. I'd won all these awards in high school, and so I get to my little Division III school, and I think like I'm just going to start and be awesome. And I found out very quickly that allowing myself to get out of shape in the off season before my freshman year and not train the way and prepare the way that I should have led to some pretty serious consequences. Not only was I weak and overweight, but in one of my first starts as a college freshman in the offensive line, I tore my ACL for the first time. And so after tearing my ACL for the first time, that was a big wake up call. So I made a lot of changes and I started getting in the weight room more. I started training harder. Like I was solely focused on like, I'm going to get back better than ever. And I'm not going to let this happen again. Well, unfortunately, I didn't have the best PT because I was working with like a Division III athletic staff. And so like there was a lot of in and out, like some of their stuff was very old school. And then I tore my ACL again. So about 8 months post-op. So that's number two. Went through the whole process again. And then unfortunately I came back for my third season. And during a 2-a-day where two of the people who were playing my position weren't available to take reps. So I had to take like all the reps there. I tore it again, just doing something simple like outside zone blocking where I needed to put my foot in the ground and get vertical. And it just gave out as I did that. So with those 3 ACLs in 3 years under my belt, I really kind of fell in love with the rehabilitation and strength training side of things as a way to change my body, to get myself back to the field. And so I dove in really hard. And I wasn't studying it in school. I was actually a communications major. But my passion for that began to kind of take over. And I realized I didn't want to wear a suit and tie every day. I didn't want to, sit in a courtroom and, write press releases as I was kind of heading towards. So I decided to come back and finish my master's degree at that school, continue playing football, So I ended up playing at a pretty high level even after all those 3 ACLs. I was able to start for 3 years after that because I had extra eligibility. Along the way, I got some internships that then allowed me to gain experience in the field. So I worked at Seton Hall University with their men's basketball team, their baseball team, a number of different schools. I worked at Parabolic, where I am now, as an intern. And I spent a lot of time in the weight room at FDU with the Olympic lifting program that they had there. They had like a team with a lot of high level Olympic lifters. So I spent a lot of time there, got experience and connections there. And just through all those experiences, I fell in love with training. And so I decided, like, I want to help other athletes in a way that I wasn't helped. I want to be able to prepare them, to help them be more injury resistant, to help them come back from injury, to help them avoid many of the pitfalls that I made and mistakes that I made along the way. And so that was my introduction to it. And then from there, like, I fell in love with Olympic weightlifting. I competed in that for a while. And luckily, I stumbled upon Parabolic as I was finishing up my master's program. And I just reached out to the head coach at the time, who was my first boss and my first mentor, Angelo Todaro. And he took me in as an intern. And within 2 months, I had a coaching job there. And from there, I've been there for 5 years now. And I went from intern to now I'm the head of education development for the company in terms of performance. I'm a head coach. I'm a master instructor. I handle private training, but also internal education, and do a lot of other things and wear a lot of hats for the company. So it's just been cool to kind of build through that and see that company change and have that opportunity. And as you mentioned in the introduction, along the way, I've gotten to work with a lot of cool different populations that have really helped mold me and grow me as a coach.
What in the last 5 years? What have been the most influential moments for you as a coach?
Yeah, this was an interesting question when I saw it, because there's so many that I wanted to go into, but picking out a couple, I think the first one was working with a PT who's a friend of mine at Parabolic. His name's Dr. Joe Myron. Very few people outside of like our walls know him, but those who do know him know that he's like one of the most brilliant minds in the industry that just hasn't gotten enough out there yet. So he actually was the guy who introduced me to PRI. And so I came in, as I said, I had this strength training background, this weightlifting background. And so everything to me was like snatch, clean and jerk, squat, like let's get big, let's get strong. I can teach that stuff all day, but I didn't know anything about about the body. I didn't know anything about mechanics, about kinesiology, about functional anatomy, about energy systems. I didn't know any of that stuff. And so it was outside of my practice. And I was dealing with some more knee pain because, again, like with my movement restrictions, snatching, clean, jerking, and squatting every day is probably not the best idea. I was seeing Joe, and we were kind of beginning to work together and collaborate on a couple different projects. And so I was seeing him for treatment for my knee as well. And I remember distinctly one day he was assessing me, and he was having me do like a Turkish get up, and I never did Turkish get ups because that didn't involve 2 hands on a bar, 2 feet on the ground. So he was like, "Man, you love that extension strategy, huh?" And I was like, "I don't know what you're talking about, man, but is it time to lift yet?" And from then on, he was kind of like, "Listen, like we need to talk about something." So he's like, "I took this course, myokinematic restoration from the Postural Restoration Institute." And so like he put me in 90-90, and he had me doing, some breathing activities. And I will never forget, at the time I was like a 500-pound squatter. And he put me in 90-90 and had me do like a normal 90-90 hip lift with 5 breaths. I was shaking, sweating, convulsing. Like it was like nothing I'd ever seen. And he's like, "You can't breathe." And I was like, "That was the hardest thing I've done in a long time. What the heck was that?" So he sat me down and he was like, "Listen, like, this is what's going on." He showed me some of the functional anatomy. And not only was that a big eye opener for me in terms of a bucket that I needed to fill and something that I needed to address as an athlete and a lifter, but also it really opened my eyes to the fact that there is so much in this industry that I did not know. And there's so much in this industry that I did not appreciate, that I needed to fill those gaps. And I got tired of being the guy who, like, oh, he knows a lot about training and lifting and coaching, but he doesn't know anatomy. He doesn't understand like the under the hood stuff. And so I was like, you know what? I'm never going to allow this to happen again. I'm going to dive in, and I'm really going to continue to learn and grow every single day. And that's kind of been one of my biggest values over the last few years. So that was a pivotal moment to me. I'll never forget him saying, you got the ischiocondylar adductor magnus attaching here, and it internally rotates and it opens the pelvic outlet. And I was like, what? Like it just completely, I was way over my head. So that was a big moment, not only personally, but professionally. And from there, it was the impetus to me really diving into PRI kind of methodology at the time. The other two that I wanted to bring up were one, there was a year, I think the second year we were coaching NFL combine athletes. So I got thrown into the combine program because we hired a guy who had connections in the NFL. That was something he did. And so he was like the liaison that brought those players to us. And so we needed somebody to coach it. So my boss was the head coach. And they were like, you played football, like you have a football background, you're assistant. I'm like, okay, cool. I know nothing about this, but let's go. So the first year I was primarily in charge of the weight room stuff, and I could do that fairly well. My boss handled the speed and agility on the field, but I didn't know anything about coaching speed and agility, nothing. So second year, they switched that. Now I was in charge of the whole program. And again, with minimal to no experience in this other than what I had seen the year before. And so basically, because the head guy who had the connections was basically running everything, we taught what he told us to teach, right? He told us certain techniques that he wanted taught on the field in terms of the change of direction, performance. Like he had been doing this for years. He would always talk about how he had all these famous athletes. And so we're teaching these techniques. And about 3 to 4 weeks in, the assistant coach and I, who's Cody Plothker, who actually is, probably been on a number of podcasts, people recognize him. He was my assistant at the time. And we both kind of started to realize like the athletes are really struggling to pick up these techniques. And when we retested, their numbers were worse. So they were getting slower and they were looking worse and they were getting frustrated. And so, no, it's not good. Not at all. Like pro days and combines are coming up and these guys are getting worse. And like, we just started to look at each other and we were like, these techniques don't make any sense. A lot of them violate simple laws of physics, right? But we hadn't approached it with the confidence to be able to teach what we wanted to teach. We were just going on whatever they were doing.
Without throwing anybody under the bus, can you maybe give an example of one of those?
Like an actual technique?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So like a perfect example is the way they were setting up cuts in the 5-10-5 or the short shuttle drill, right? Mm-hmm. So the whole idea was you need to have both feet inside the line and you're going to reach your outside hand over your outside leg and then you're going to just get as deep as you can and you're going to lean as far in over the inside leg as possible because that picks up like 2 to 3 inches. All these people who are stepping over the line or on the line, like they're stupid. You know what I mean? So the feet were inside the line. And basically what that was creating was this ridiculously narrow base of support with a need to like get the hand to the ground outside of the outside plant leg that no athlete is going to have the mobility and range of motion capability to get to. So it was like this precise footwork that needed to be planted at the exact right spot in order to make it work. And the athlete needed like unbelievable ability to change levels. And so like nobody could do it, especially the bigger guys. And so it became very, very, very frustrating for them. And it was slowing them down. And I think the biggest thing for me was it was robbing them of their athleticism. It was turning them into robots as opposed to athletes, right? They got there for a reason. They're not going to the NFL combine if they're not athletic. And we were trying to make them fit some sort of technical model that this guy thought he had gamed the system for. And it was robbing them of everything that made them great. And so one day we just kind of made a decision like, hey, we're going to change things. And so from a communication perspective, we said to them, hey, if you're not feeling great about the techniques, there's a plan B. There's another option. You can try this. So we didn't like say like scrap everything. Because we didn't want to lose trust and buy-in. We were like, hey, there's another option here. And so as lo and behold, as soon as we made those changes and gave them the freedom to move the way that they do within certain technical constraints, right? Still teaching good plant angles, still teaching changing levels, but allowing them to move more freely and express their athleticism, all of a sudden times got way better. And guys who deserve to be at a high level were at a high level. And that same season, we actually had a guy come in from Exos halfway through because he was finishing up at Exos. He was getting ready for a pro day locally. And so he needed somewhere to train for about a week or two before that. And this dude's a freak. He's actually now a Super Bowl champion with the Chiefs. But so he came in and he was doing the techniques that we had taught afterward, right? The second batch. And he was running times that nearly nobody else in our group was running. And so it really reinforced for us, like, this is what needs to be done. And we have to be okay with maybe um, kind of creating a little bit of conflict between us and the guy who was running things. But luckily, we had the support of our immediate bosses who recognized that it was the right choice. And so that experience really grew me professionally from a communication standpoint and as a coach, because that was a scary period to navigate in terms of having to communicate with those guys. But it also made me realize, like, I need to dive in deep on speed and agility. I need to know everything there is that I can possibly figure out about it, because that is the most important thing to these athletes. And realistically, that's the most important things to the athletes that I work with on a day-to-day basis, right? None of them have to lift weights to play their sport, but they absolutely have to cut and sprint and do all these things. So I dove into a lot of teaching in terms of like the fundamentals of sprinting, both acceleration and max velocity from a track perspective. And then I just dove into a ton of multi-directional speed, and then came back to physics as well, just understanding like basic laws of physics and appreciating how that applies to the movement world that we exist in. And then the last one, just to not make this too long-winded, was the very next experience I had once that combine period ended. I got moved to another location that we were opening up, which was brand new. It's in an ice rink, as a number of ours are, and they had they had nothing but hockey players and figure skaters in the entire building. But the figure skaters were like very serious figure skaters. So they start when they're like 3. They compete. They had like, I think, 11 or 12 Olympians at one point. These kids are homeschooled. They're training 5 to 8 times a day. Like, this is life. So I knew nothing about figure skating. So it was like getting thrown in the fire. And I'll never forget, we assessed one of their athletes, and we're taking them through our movement assessment, our strength training assessment, like our performance assessment based on like jump profiling, all that stuff. And we had him do a kettlebell goblet squat with a 12-kilo kettlebell. And this is like an adult male. He's 18 or 19 years old, figure skater, very high level, very explosive. We're thinking we just want to look at his movement patterns. Can't imagine anything could possibly go wrong with a blue kettlebell. His squat looked good. So we were like, oh, awesome. Let's do a couple sets of it. So we did like 2 sets of 8 to 10 reps with a 12-kilo belt. The next day, his coach comes storming into the gym. What did you do to my athlete? I had to send him home. I know he's a crybaby, but this is ridiculous. Like, he was useless to me today. This kid was so sore and so banged up from just doing those sets that he had to miss an entire day on the ice. And man, we heard about it for days after. So that was a big eye opener to me. It was like, these athletes do not respond well to heavy strength training. They don't respond well to resistance training at all, because neurologically and physiologically, their bodies are not adapted to handle heavy external loading, even any external loading, right? They may be able to jump and land and do incredible things on a blade with their body weight, but that is what they are adapted for. And so what we started to realize was the best figure skaters that we had were those who were incredibly effective at utilizing the stretch shortening cycle, especially the fast stretch shortening cycle. And we can kind of get into that later if we want to, but they were unbelievable with that. They were terrible if they had to slow down and use more muscular work via the contractile element of the muscle and create active tension. But they were great if you gave them the opportunity to bounce and rebound, right? And so what we had to do is we had to change our paradigm a little bit, and our training, our strength training, had to, because we knew that would benefit them, right? We knew that would sometimes take their ability to a new level if we could develop just enough force production via the contractile element and via like the slow stretch shortening cycle to benefit some of their jumps, as well as their conditioning, actually. So we had to embed that in a way that gave them a little bit of what we thought they needed or what we knew they needed, and a lot of what they were already good at and what they wanted, right? So that we could speak to their experience and make sure that we weren't putting them in a position where strength training was impacting their on ice performance. And so that was a big eye opener for me, and it forced me to dive into a lot of the literature on the stretch shortening cycle and power, and really understand the demands of their sport greater. So those were three very humbling but very influential experiences that have kind of driven me in those three directions, honestly, for the last 4 years or so.
I definitely want to come back and pick on some of that PRI, that change of direction work, that different profiles of athletes, even from a maybe from a fiber standpoint, or like you said, the more reactive ones versus the more kind of force dominant ones. But I'm really interested in your perspective on training with kids, actually, because you post quite a bit on your Instagram about the work that you do with some of the young kids that train with you. And so I wanted to get from your perspective the fundamental building blocks and movement skills of coaching kids, let's say preteen, because again, we see a lot of stuff out there, and I coach myself a 12-year-old, and it's true that there's things that you think about, oh, that's just we're going to do like with the adults, and he'll do this and he'll do that. First of all, it's got to be fun, otherwise there's no way you get the buy-in. And second, you actually see that they don't function the same, and
Yeah.
they need different stuff. So how did you get to approach that, and how do you now kind of structure your view of coaching kids?
Yeah. So I work with a couple different populations of young kids. Like I work in group settings sometimes with really young kids, like anywhere from 6 to 12. But then I actually also have a number of private clients who are fairly young kids. And their parents have kind of approached me and said, like, hey, like, I want private training for my son. And honestly, like at first I was like, your son does not need private training. He's 8, right? Like he needs to be in a group with his peers. And but after talking to the parents and talking to the kids and assessing the kids, I realized it was actually a really good fit. Like the kids were mature, they were hard workers, they wanted to have fun, and their parents were supportive of the idea of like long-term development, right? But they wanted it with the one-on-one experience. So I was like, this is great. And so I have kids who are like 8 years old. I got 12-year-olds. I got a couple 14-year-olds, like 13. So they're getting to the teenage years, but I got them when they were 12 or 13. So for me, the biggest thing, as you mentioned, is it has to be enjoyable. It has to be fun because the long term approach is I want these kids to enjoy physical activity. I want them to enjoy training. I want them to still be training hard when it's time to actually reach the period where we're going to drive physiological and neurological adaptations related to specific sport performance. But right now, our goal is to lay the widest and broadest foundation possible, right? If I'm thinking of a pyramid, I want the base of that pyramid as wide and deep as possible so that I can build on top of that foundation as they get older. And if they don't want to train anymore, then nothing above that matters, right? So as you mentioned, fun is a huge piece of it. But then on top of that, I look at training kids as variety, novelty, and coordination, motor skill acquisition are the biggest things that we are looking at here. And so there are some sensitive periods for development that I think are really important in young kids. So a lot of times we talk about like plyometrics and fast stretch shortening cycle activities. And the literature will tell you you should squat 1.5 times body weight before you do these things, right? And maybe to an extent that's true. But I've seen enough kids throw themselves off of every conceivable implement and just bounce that I'm starting to think that it's a little bit more than that, right? And so when you have young kids, you have this sensitive period where whether they're gifted in terms of like fiber type and neurological, stuff, as well as like the shape of their body, which is another thing we can touch on later, like shape of their skeleton and of their system really has a significant impact on their internal forces and their force production capabilities. So all of that stuff is predetermined to an extent, right? But they are so plastic and so able to be molded at a young age that you can take a kid who really doesn't have a whole lot of natural gifts athletically, and you can set them up for long-term success if you give them the right training stimulus. So I look at it as an opportunity if we teach them to utilize the fast stretch shortening cycle, to bounce, right? To be really bouncy and elastic, then not only does their nervous system learn the coordination necessary to have the overcoming contraction and the stiffness to be able to utilize the stretch shortening cycle via transferring force to like more of the elastic, non-contractile elements of the system, but we actually prepare their tissues and develop their tissues in a way that maximizes their ability to utilize that fast stretch shortening cycle. So with young kids, I'm going to do a lot of like bouncy type work because I look at that as not only a structural but a neurological skill acquisition. And it's not like high intensity stuff. We're talking about jumping rope. We're talking about pogos. We're talking about low box plyos from like Lee Taft. We're talking about one of my favorites, which is the Rudiment series from Altus that Dan Paff has been talking about for a long time. So we'll use all kinds of multi-directional, unilateral, bilateral, very low amplitude, very high volume and short ground contact plyos, because I think that stuff has just been lost. And it's things that kids used to do all the time. Like they'd go on the park, they'd skip rope, they'd jump rope, they'd run around. And now they don't get recess as much. They don't get as much time to play. They spend all their time in a classroom, and then they follow that up with a very organized sport performance practice that they do year round, right? And so many of these neuromuscular and neurophysiological qualities that maybe were developed just through free play in the past, they don't get. And so that brings me to another concept, which is I do want to teach kids motor skill acquisition. I do want to teach them proper positioning here and there. And I'll do that sometimes in my warm up, right? So if I want to teach a kid how to be able to manage a good sprint posture or a good sprint position, we'll use all variety of marches and skips and marches with a pause and the boom series from Altus and all kinds of other activities to teach them and reinforce good positioning. But I look at sport as a problem solving activity where movement is used as the solution to the problem, right? And that's straight out of super trading. Like that's Siffin's Askeorsi, but I think it's such a valuable concept. It's like it's a problem in which we have to come up with a movement solution. And so from a very young age, I want young kids to have to problem solve with movement more than I want to teach them exactly what to do, right? So my goal is to put them in as many situations as possible where I give them a task that maybe is a little bit more open-ended or a little bit more competitive or a little bit more problem-solving in nature, and I get them to have to figure out what the best solution is. And maybe they lose or maybe they fail that rep or whatever it is, but just through that, the learning motor system then is like, oh, okay, that didn't work. I'm going to try something different this time, even at a subconscious level. And all of a sudden now they begin to self-organize movement because we know they have all the degrees of freedom in the world, right? Most young kids are not going to have restrictions in their movement capabilities, but they need to learn to coordinate their body more effectively to be successful in these tasks. So we'll do a lot of open-ended games. We'll do a lot of multi-directional speed and chase games. We'll play tag. We'll do all kinds of stuff from that perspective that, again, forces them to solve problems with movement solutions. And I also love using obstacle courses. Like when I have the opportunity, I'll set up all kinds of obstacle courses that force the kids to do all kinds of rolling, crawling, jumping, landing, walking on like a balance beam, walking in a low lunge, all kinds of stuff like that, where again, they see it as play, they see it as fun and engaging, and I see them moving through these ranges of motion and moving through these positions that I really want to expose them to. And so that's really important to me. And then on top of that, just from an overall programming standpoint, we spend a lot of time on the ground. We're going to have them roll. We're going to have them crawl. We're going to have them do like animal flow type movements, but not just like animal flow, like the thing, literally getting them to be imaginative that they're animals as they do these movements. So I heard Jeremy Frisch on a podcast talking one time about, in his old PE textbooks, it would be like run like an elephant or run like, this. And so we'll do that kind of stuff. We'll do what's called gorilla walks. So picture like a kid gets into a really deep squat. They put their hands on the floor in front of them, get their heels to the floor, and then they'll reach over the outside of one of their legs and pull themselves into another deep squat with their arms. And they literally work their way down the floor that way. And I'll be like, make gorilla sounds, like make animal sounds. So you're engaging them, getting their imagination to come into play, while at the same time, every single time they hit the floor, they're in a deep squat, right? They're getting into a position that I want them to be able to retain. They're expressing mobility through a full range of motion. They're expressing, respiratory variability throughout the system, if we want to look at it that way. And they're learning to decelerate forces at the same time and manipulate their body through three-dimensional space. So all of that is super important to me when I'm working with young kids, and I'll use that throughout our warm-up. The other thing that we'll do a lot of is sprinting, right? I think it's one of the most underrated aspects of youth development is like kids should be sprinting from the jump. And we're talking about like because they're young kids, it's like taking a Prius out and red line a Prius, right? The output is just never going to be that of a Ferrari. So we don't need a ton of rest in between. We don't need a ton of like max effort sprint followed by a long recovery. We do our sprinting in a number of different ways. We try to expose them to every conceivable starting position we can imagine. So we'll do everything from like I love Derek Hansen's kind of approach to this, where he has like soft starts, falling starts, ground based starts. We'll do starts from like a pogo jump. We'll do starts from a skip. We'll do starts from an A run, and then we'll have them take a lot of stuff from Lee Taft and do a lot of like tag games, multi-directional speed games, where again they're learning to self-organize proper acceleration techniques by getting feedback about the outcome. Were they successful? Were they unsuccessful? And a lot of times, I think, and this goes into a question you kind of had later. A lot of times, we try to teach young athletes from like this very progressed, regimented perspective of like, okay, to learn to sprint, you have to learn to march. You have to learn to wall, march. You have to learn to this. And it's like a lot of times, if you just put athletes in a situation where they want to try really hard, like you give them a ball drop and then you drop the ball and they have to sprint and get it before it hits the ground twice. If you video that, all of a sudden you see a lot of really quality positions being hit because the athlete learns like, oh, I have to orient myself forward and strike the ground back and sprint really hard if I want to get to the ball, right? And now I'm seeing technical sprint positions that I would want to teach them organized simply because they've learned throughout repetition, like, oh, if I don't do this, if I don't hit the ground a certain way, then I'm not going to get to the ball. And subconsciously, they begin to figure that out. So we'll do a lot of that. We'll do a lot of, as I said, extensive plyometrics. We'll do a lot of like unilateral landing, hide ins, hops, multi-directional. We'll do a lot of like jumping and landing, again, not for the purpose of like high intensity rate of force development, but for utilizing this very sensitive period in their development to teach their nervous system to coordinate their body effectively and at very high velocities, because that sets them up for those higher level plyos later. So instead of doing a broad jump, I'll set out a series of like circle, like hula hoops, and I'll have them jump from hula hoop to hula hoop. And I'll tell them you have to stick and you got to land it and you got to pretend like I'm going to come and knock you over and you got to be ready for that. And so like they'll jump and land, and this benefits them in two ways. A, I start telling them, hey, pretend you're like hopping over lily pads or there's hot lava on the floor. Don't touch the floor. And so they get imaginative with it. They start having fun. But at the same time, now I control the distance they can jump, so that a lot of time you'll see like an athlete jump if you tell them to do a broad jump, especially young ones, and they'll just crash on the landing, right? So I control the distance they jump. I control the landing position. I force them to have a goal for their landing so they're not just rolling into the next one. And then I can do it in all kinds of multi-directional ways, because we know that power and we know that rate of force development is going to be direction specific, right? So if we want them to develop change of direction ability and lateral acceleration and all that, we can use some of our fun plyos and fun jumps that are lower in intensity to develop some of those qualities. And then finally, from a strength training perspective, again, to me, it's all about variety and it's all about motor skill acquisition, right? Again, I don't care about loading them at this point. My goal is to get them to be able to express control through a full range of motion and to be able to manipulate their own body weight in space effectively. And then if I want to put any external loading on them, I'm going to do it in a way that speaks to something that is very easy to do and provides very few technical constraints. So we'll push sleds, right? We'll sprint with sleds. We'll have kids do like strongman style stuff for fun. Like they'll pick up a med ball and shoulder it and carry it, right? Or they'll do like a med ball to box, almost like a stone loading activity. They'll do all kinds of wheelbarrow races and bear crawls on their hands. We'll have them do seal walks. We'll have them do a lot of like duck walking. They'll do single leg squats to box. They'll do regular squats to box with like slow tempos. All of those things are in play, but I'm always thinking, after a kid gets good at something, right, some specific strength training skill that I want them to get good at, my first thought is not how can I add more load to this? It's how can I challenge coordination? How can I challenge stability? How can I challenge their ability to express quality movement across the widest spectrum possible so that they're more effective when they get older as movers, when it's finally time to actually start to load them to get the adaptations we want.
It's almost like restricting yourself and not wanting to kind of push vertically and just push laterally in terms of that's acquired. Now we go left or right. We don't go up from there.
Yes, and it's always like well thought out. It's never. I think sometimes people hear variety and they think of like almost chaos. It's like you're just randomly doing stuff, right? But that's not it. It's variety for the sake of establishing movement principles, right, with them, and then saying, okay, you can sprint. Let's say you can sprint from a 2 point stance. Awesome. But how does that sprint look when you come out of a push-up start? How does that sprint look when you come out of an A run? Do you understand and are you able to transfer those attractor states, as like Fran Bosch would talk about from dynamical systems theories? Can you transfer those attractor states across different starting positions and across different tasks and across different demands? That to me is the most important thing, because that builds a very robust motor strategy that then allows them to transfer that into more high level outputs later. So yeah, even with my younger baseball player, he's 14, he's in high school. Obviously, his season is not happening this year because of what's going on, but he's starting to hit a point where we can focus on a little more output. But I'm still, as a 14-year-old, I am still providing a great deal of variety. So right now is actually a perfect opportunity because he doesn't have access to a ton of heavy weights. But if even if I was in the gym, I wouldn't be loading him up with a ton of like heavy safety bar squatting, even though he can execute a safety bar squat. I started doing like goblet oscillatory isometric stuff with him where there's like a fast drop. We'll do a lot of variations of split squats, both rear foot and front foot elevated. Started working on like single leg squatting progressions, right? All of these things because, again, I'm not interested in his max back squat at all, to be honest with you, or his max squat in general. He's a baseball player. And so like I need him to be able to hit the cover off the ball and express rotation, and he's got to run a fast 60 one day because he wants to play college baseball. And so our focus is on multi-directional speed skills and then utilizing the weight room to address specific movement qualities and tissue qualities that support his multi-directional speed and athletic performance on the baseball field and don't hinder it. And I think that's sometimes where, especially with young athletes, we run into problems because we bring them in and we put a bar on their back right away, or we start focusing on like progressive overload of weight right away. And I always think like people don't realize that there's so many ways to apply a progressive overload that have nothing to do with increasing the intensity and the load, right? Just changing and varying the starting position in a sprint, or changing the way that you load a squat, or going from a split squat to beginning a single leg squat to box progression. Those are all variable ways to increase progressive overload and challenge the motor system that leads to a more robust athlete as you go forward and doesn't hinder their progress.
Like you said, you've been fortunate to have parents that were understanding of the long-term process. Have you ever had to deal with parents that wanted to see output and they were like, well, you're not working him hard enough, you need to do more with him?
Yeah, and absolutely. And there's always going to be parents who want to see some sort of like objective change. And they also want to see like, there's more, I guess there's more parents now who are coming and saying, I want my kid to be bigger and stronger earlier, because I think the old myth of like strength training is bad for kids, that's starting to go away. And more parents are hearing like, oh, strength training is good for kids, and they're specializing earlier. So they're like, oh, I want my kid, lifting heavy and running a 5-10-5. I'm like, he's 8. Like he does not need to worry about that. Like, let's develop him long term. But I think what gets missed is people hear like what I just said and they think that they don't work hard. They work really hard, right? They're sprinting, they're changing directions, they're jumping, they're crawling. We're giving them very little rest time because, again, their outputs are not high enough to warrant a significant rest time. So we can actually develop them aerobically while just doing their speed, agility, and strength training. Because if you ever watch an 8-year-old sprint, right, they sprint like crazy and then they like pop up and they're like, all right, let's go sprint again. Like they don't need a break. They're not like us. So at that point, like I think we see them sweating, we see them training hard, right? And we're challenging them from a coordination standpoint while they're training hard, and we're exposing them to such a wide variety of activities that it works out really well overall, because the parent just sees them doing a lot of hard work and thinks like, oh, this is great. But just to check all my boxes, I will always take some sort of objective measure. So I have no problem testing a vertical jump or a fore jump on a young kid, right? Because I look at it as like they should be able to handle their body weight and jump on a jump mat, right? And again, I'm not too concerned about seeing that number go up, but they are at such a right, like they get the newbie gains that everybody talks about, right? All they have to do is be forced to learn to coordinate their body both intermuscularly, intramuscularly, and from a neural standpoint more effectively, and all of a sudden you see their outputs going up. So just by challenging their motor system to be more effective across all of these different movement skills, we see performance increase. And so I can say to the parent, like, A, here is your vertical jump going up, right? B, they're working hard. C, here are videos I've taken of their sprints, especially if I'm working in a private setting. Even like young kids, I will take videos so that I can look back on all of those things and compare apples to apples. And I'll say, like, hey, look at the change that we got in this individual sprint technique, and here's what I'm looking for, and here's why this is so important to them. And so the parents always know that I'm still monitoring some of those important motor skills. I'm just improving it through a way that, like, again, does not ask them to constantly progressively overload the intensity, but more progressively overload the challenge to their motor system.
Where does that transition happen for you in terms of age or developmental status from that, let's say, lateral focus to the more vertical focus where you're actually going to start going for outputs? Do you, in your mind, considering that, I guess the performance settings or the school performance settings that they're going to be in are going to be doing this, do you think of kind of staying more on the back end and making sure that all the boxes are checked, or are you going to kind of push in that direction with them at some point as well?
I think it really depends on the situation, and that's a cop out answer. So I'll give all kinds of examples here. But I think like if you're working in a situation where you have a young athlete and they're hitting a point in their career where they are mature enough and their parents are able to kind of collaborate with you and say like, hey, we're starting to look at showcases, we're starting to look at camps, we're starting to look at schools for college, right? Those things would tend to be an indicator that maybe it's time to drive specific performance, right? And I think it happens more organically, especially if you're working with an athlete long enough, right? The kid that I always post, the dangerous one on my Instagram, he's a long term client. His dad is bought in for the long haul. He's had like 8 brothers and sisters play Division 1 sports, just like a factory of high level baseball. And so they get it, and they've already seen a massive increase in his performance. And again, we haven't been driving any performance variables other than, hey, we're going to get really good at linear acceleration from every conceivable position. And he is a diligent worker and he cares about it. And like, I'm blessed to work with him. But that to me is like, it has come organically. And so he's 14 now, right? He's going to have a freshman and a sophomore baseball season. To me, junior year of high school and senior year of high school for these kids is when you're going to start to drive a little more specific in terms of adaptation, because you know they need to perform at a certain level in some of these physical tests now, because baseball camps and combines are going to look at a 60, right? They're going to look at exit velocity off the bat. They're going to look at a number of these different things. And so I'm going to monitor my performance parameters that matter to them. They're going to monitor theirs. We're going to collaborate on those two things. And if something needs to be kind of brought up to meet where they want to go, then somewhere around, 15, 16, 17 is where we're going to make that transition. But to me, if you're able to work with them long enough, it happens very, very organically, right? It's just, you've built the base for so long and you've built so much variety, and now you have a robust system that can handle a little more stress, and they have your movement model in a place where you're happy with that. Then you can begin to overload a little bit. And I think that happens as they get older. Now, if you're working in a scenario where obviously they're training with their school as well, then I think it's more about us twofold, taking a back seat to some extent and making sure that we fill the gaps that are not being filled at school. And then B, making sure that if, let's say they're doing it with like a sport coach, right? They're lifting with a sport coach who doesn't really have a background in strength training. I am going to teach them some of the lifts that they need to know to be successful there. I'm going to educate them and talk to them about the potential, maybe negative ramifications of doing those lifts incorrectly. And also potentially finding a way that they don't have to do those lifts all the time, if it's possible and okay with their coach, right? And then I'm going to fill the gaps. So if they're doing a lot of heavy bilateral lifting, and I know programs that will take baseball players and they're doing snatches and they're doing clean and jerks and they're doing back squats, and I'm like, that is the opposite of helping the situation. Then I'm going to spend a lot more time on like the respiratory based strategies, movement variability, single leg activities, both for upper and lower, trunk control activities, and then high rate of force development activities, and fast stretch shortening cycle activities that do not involve heavy loading, because we know that that power end of the spectrum that the Olympic lifts are going to kind of address is going to be very different from a very short round contact plyo, some sort of hurdle jump, depth jump, bounding variation, skipping, all of that stuff. So basically, I have all of my buckets, right? And I figure out which ones are being filled by the school and some other program, and which ones do I need to address to help this athlete remain healthy, remain well rounded, and be able to continue to develop over time. So that's definitely a tough one to navigate. But I think if we put the athlete first and we say, hey, like, it's obviously not a perfect world, we don't have complete control over the situation. What buckets can I fill to make sure that this person doesn't get hurt and is able to continue to progress the way that I need them to? That's the best we can do in that circumstance.
I like the term bucket that you use, and switching gears a bit towards change of direction. What are your micro buckets within that change of direction bucket in terms of, we know, well, let's talk about a linear sprint. You got your start, you got your acceleration phase, and then if you want to go deep, you got your transition, and then you got your max velocity and then speed endurance on the back end, depending on the distance. What are your micro buckets when it comes to change of direction? Because I feel like as much as linear sprint has been dissected and cut into its constituents part, and you can train each one and put them back together. For me, at least change of direction is still, I'm starting to get a grasp of it, but I don't have the same structured, let's say, understanding of it. So I'd love to hear your way of framing the physical quality, let's say.
Yeah, yeah. So this has been my muse for a while now, and it's something I'm diving into a lot. So it's something I love to talk about. And like I had some elements of this in my head, but I think Ty Terrell, who works with the Atlanta Hawks now, who's formerly of IFAST and who's been a protege of like Lee Taps, and like when I talk to him, he just puts things in such a practical way that it makes an unbelievable amount of sense for me. And so his like the model that we were discussing the other day was position, force production, motor skill acquisition, and then I add capacity to that in terms of change of direction ability. So let me break that down. Position is, do you have the requisite ranges of motion and the requisite variability throughout the skeleton to achieve the position necessary that I think you need to achieve during this change of direction, or let's even say linear sprint, right? Because I can't coach you or I can't strength train you out of a position where you don't have the ability to achieve what I need you to achieve because there's a restriction, right? So A, bucket is, do you have the variability throughout the skeleton? B, force production, right? Specific force production. Are you able to produce enough force at low velocities in general? Because if you don't have low velocity force production at all, then you can't produce significant forces at high velocities because your ceiling is so much lower. That being said, you can have all the force production at low velocities you could possibly want in the world, and if you can't translate that to the specific velocities necessary for the performance of the sprint or change of direction, then it's useless. So I always give the example of a combine athlete I had who's a 600-pound squatter, like legitimately a 600-pound squatter. I saw him squat 450 at like 0.6 meters per second on the gym aware for triples. And I was like first person that I've ever actually like heard say, hey, I squat 600, and then actually could back it up. And I was like, wow, this guy's like explosive as hell. And so he's a linebacker preparing for the combine, and we test his vert. He jumped 27 inches. That is not going to get it done at the NFL level, right? And so it was such an eye-opening experience for me, because it was like, he's got all the force production in the world against heavy loads and low velocities. He can't transfer it because his tissues are so stiff from all the heavy loading, and his nervous system is so used to producing force at low velocities and grinding and producing high pressure that he can't bounce. He can't utilize the elasticity in the system, so none of it matters. So that's my force production bucket. And then specific motor skill acquisition is going to be bucket three. And that is like, okay, do you have the position, the force production? You do. Awesome. But your specific skill relevant to your sport or that I want you to perform is not there. Then it's a technical issue. Then it's a coaching issue. Then it's a drilling issue. Then it's, I need you to be able to put all of that together in this specific context, right? And then finally, and this is one that I've been thinking about a lot, is capacity, right? So maybe you have all the first three buckets. You can execute a shuffle change of direction, or you can execute a linear acceleration flawlessly on rep one. You got the position, you got the force production. But by quarter two or quarter three, it's a whole different story, right? Because we know that fatigue changes everything. And we know that motor coordination and motor output are going to change significantly in the face of fatigue. And so maybe you can't execute that skill repetitively, which I need you to do across the game. So those are my big buckets for those four things. And then from there, I break it down even further. So if we're talking about change of direction performance, I recently did a presentation for Rebel Performance, and my five big KPIs I outlined were the ability to change levels, the ability to rotate through the axial skeleton with relative motions, the ability to ramp up stiffness at the appropriate time very rapidly, effective use of the stretch shortening cycle, especially the fast stretch shortening cycle, and then orientation of force application. So changing level simply refers to the ability to lower the center of gravity to be able to get into a position that allows you to effectively absorb and distribute stresses across the system, as well as set you up to be able to do all of those other KPIs that I just mentioned. You can't utilize elasticity if the spring is too stiff and you're unable to yield enough to change levels at all. You can't take advantage of the viscoelastic bounce of the guts internally, which gives you a lot of force production going the other way. And you can't orient your forces effectively horizontally. So I was looking at research that basically showed that faster athletes are able to change levels more rapidly as they go from point of foot contact to maximum point of turnaround in a change of direction. So during that braking phase, they change levels more, they lower their center of gravity more, and they do it faster. And then I also saw that athletes who don't change levels, who don't lower their center of gravity, tend to get rotation, compensatory rotation elsewhere. So you see an increase in like tibial internal rotation or tibial external rotation associated with the fact that what most people don't realize is that changing levels is turning, it's rotation. So if I want to lower my center of gravity in a cut effectively without compensating through like my spine or through my knee or through my ankle, I need to have relative motions within the pelvis, within the thorax, and throughout the system where one bone is moving on another. And so specifically for like the deepest change of direction, we're going to need internal rotation and the ability to expand the pelvis and the rib cage at a certain level in order to lower the center of gravity and then to be able to propel out. So that's my rotational bucket. I need to be able to make a right hand turn if I'm doing a right foot cut, and I need to be able to get the ilium moving on the sacrum into internal rotation and sacral nutation, and I need to be able to push fluid volume down into the pelvis to a certain degree to allow me to change directions. From the ramping up stiffness perspective, this is where a lot of the bracing stuff comes in, right? If I am braced all the time, if I'm using a superficial compressive strategy to lock myself into a position, then I restrict my ability to turn. I restrict my ability to change levels, to lower my center of gravity, and to utilize that elastic rebound of the yield and then overcome action that is inherent in the viscoelastic tissues of my body. So I need to be able to ramp up stiffness at the right time to stop my momentum going in one direction and redirect it in the other. And part of this, and my focus of the presentation on this, was the abdominal wall. So a lot of people talk about core bracing, right? And really like maintaining tension in there. But the core has to function in a very dynamic way in change of direction ability, right? So the guts, your internal fluid basically that exists in your abdomen, it moves. Those things are not directly attached to the axial skeleton. So that fluid volume of your internal organs moves as you go and change direction. So imagine if I'm moving to the right and I plant my foot, my guts are actually going to continue to move down and to the right and slam into my pelvis and the side of my abdominal wall. And I need to be able to ramp up stiffness in my plant leg as well as my abdominal wall to literally stop and catch the guts and redirect my body in the opposite direction. So picture like you're driving along one day, all of a sudden the light turns red in front of you and you slam on the brakes as hard as you can and you get that whiplash effect of your body, right? The guts behave like people in a car because there's a delay and then they go smashing into whatever's in front of them. And if you don't have the requisite stiffness in the system and the ability to ramp up that stiffness at the right time, then you're either A, going to get stuck in the cut or fall over, or B, you're going to be like a stiff bro and you're never going to be able to get into the cut to begin with because you're so stiff all the time. You never are able to yield, would be the word I would use. So that's a really important bucket. And then, as we talked about a lot, effective use of the stretch shortening cycle. Change of direction and multidirectional speed is elastic dominant. It is the ability to utilize stored elastic energy throughout the system. And a lot of people only think of like muscles and tendons, but every tissue of your body stores elastic energy. Bones, ligaments, fascia, aponeurosis, intramuscular passive elements, the contractile element itself. All of these things deform and utilize elastic energy and return it for us if we're effective at using it. So I'm always trying to get athletes more effective at utilizing the stretch shortening cycle because that permits them to create higher forces, higher power outputs in shorter ground contact times, which is always the goal of change of direction performance. And then finally, this one was really interesting to me, the orientation of force application. So this is becoming talked about a lot in linear sprinting via like JB Morin and a lot of the research from their group. So they're showing that really high level sprinters are able to orient their ground reaction forces in the horizontal direction more effectively, and they can do it longer across a sprint and more gradually rise their center of gravity as they still direct their forces horizontally than less qualified sprinters. So the same thing applies to change of direction. It's just not as borne out in the research yet, but it's starting to come out a lot more in the last couple of years. So what you see is greater horizontal braking forces, greater horizontal propulsive forces, both in the contact prior to the plant foot, what they call the penultimate contact, and the plant foot contact. You see more peak horizontal braking and propulsive forces, and you see ratios of horizontal to vertical forces that are far more in favor of the horizontal in faster change of direction performance. So that ties back into our ability to change levels, to be able to create a plant angle outside of our base of support that allows the athlete to lower their center of gravity, to plant their foot and apply a great deal of horizontal braking force to the ground, and then create horizontal propulsive forces to project themselves in the new intended direction. So those are my 5 big buckets. And then from there, I say, okay, what skills need to be developed related to the athlete's sport or to their overall athleticism? And so I break it down into linear acceleration, max velocity sprinting, lateral acceleration, change of direction or cutting, retreating, hip turn, curvilinear running, linking skills, and mistake recovery. And many of those are borrowed from track, and many of those are borrowed from Lee Taft. So I always want to give credit where credit's due for where my model comes from. I just steal from people who are a lot smarter than me. But those skills I've identified over time as being kind of the critical elements that I want to develop in all athletes. And then to your point earlier about specialization, then it's a matter of figuring out what does this person need for their sport, right? Because a baseball player's demands for change of direction are very different from a wide receiver in American football, right? So I need to appreciate those things. And while I want to develop all of them, I will then over time put a greater focus on certain elements. So like my baseball athlete, right? Linear acceleration is the foundation. He needs to understand linear acceleration. Otherwise, change of direction and max velocity are not really particularly relevant. So we've focused heavily on linear acceleration. After that, though, when you look at a shortstop in baseball, there's a lot of what I would refer to as a lateral run step, or people refer to as a crossover run, because he has to be able to track the ball with his eyes and orient his glove to make a play on the ball while he runs laterally to cover the space between second base and third base, right? So we'll work on a lot of lateral accelerations with what I would call a lateral run step. And then we'll also work accelerations from like a lateral start, like he will need on the base path. And then finally, I think, okay, he needs to be able to accelerate from a square stance. So we need a really effective plyo step, that, as Lee would call it. And then going backwards If a fly ball goes over his head, I need him to be able to hip turn and get into a linear acceleration or a lateral run step. So we're constantly working on the ability to reposition the feet effectively and then orient his ground reaction forces to project him in the new intended direction. And so we'll work on all of that with, again, the mindset that he's 14. And so I want to develop the most holistic athlete possible. So I may do things that don't necessarily speak to his sport for the purpose of global understanding of force application to the ground and orientation of his body in space.
Maybe to bounce on what you mentioned about horizontal force application, correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember that as well later in the game or after repeated sprints, that force application is now different. They're not able to apply as much horizontal as, so that would also affect, well, in a change of direction setting, I'm sure the, 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 the relationship would be the same as in when you get more tired, your ability to change level is going to change. Your ability to plant with a certain angle is going to change. So that ties into the energetics part and the, I guess, the conditioning part of change of direction itself, correct?
Yeah, 100%. And I think I've read that piece that you're referring to. I think also by JB Morin's group,
Hmm.
where they showed that there were differences in ground contact, in force orientation, and in the role of the musculature during like repeated sprints. And they were actually looking at it with like hamstring injuries. And so that was really interesting to me. But this is something I've been thinking more about in terms of change of direction, right? I think sometimes in our industry we get overly specific. So we try to like recreate the demands of the field, and that's not good, right? We have to understand that much of what we do is general. But I think when it comes to energetics and sport performance, we have to appreciate that specificity is going to be king here, right? So I love Joel Jamieson's work. He was a huge influence on me. And the guys at Train Adapt Evolve, I know you've been talking to Aaron Davis and Pat Estes, like those guys are huge influences on my theoretical understanding of energetics, and that was a game changer for me. And I think that now what I'm starting to see is there's a lot of cases where we'll do many of these methods like HICT, alactic repeats from Joel Jamieson, HRI, like all of these great things, cardiac output. Like we use all these methods with an appreciation that the aerobic system is important. We have to build a robust, energetic aerobic system that allows us to repeat efforts. But the specifics of change of direction and acceleration performance in sport dictate that we have to prepare athletes for those repeated outputs because they are very different than simply pushing a sled for repeated sprints or doing HICT step ups, right? Or doing any sort of interval that we might do in the gym. And all you have to do is do like repeated sled sprints and then go the next day and do like repeated high intensity cuts or just play basketball against your friends, right? And all of a sudden you're like huffing and puffing, you're exhausted, your muscles are burning, you're sore for days after, and you're like, what the heck? Like I'm really aerobically fit. I don't understand why I'm so beat up from this. The reality is all of those fast contacts, all of those elastic movements, all of those changes of direction and reacceleration in the opposite direction place a specific demand on the body, right? And so you're going to see greater muscular work in more aggressive changes of direction. So the greater the angle of change of direction, so say like a 60-degree cut versus a 180-degree cut, you're going to see longer ground contacts, more muscular work, more reliance on the slow stretch shortening cycle, right? So that is going to be fatiguing. You're also going to see if you don't have necessarily the coordination to yield and then overcome very rapidly, you're going to see athletes who create occlusions, talking from like Train Adapt Evolve and like the Moxie end of things. You'll see occlusal influences that are going to potentially restrict venous outflow or even arterial inflow, which can have a significant impact on your ability to repeat those outputs if you're doing that every time you change directions. And then from a tissue standpoint, all of those very short, quick ground contacts that are elastic, I think a lot of times athletes, if they're not developed from an elastic efficiency perspective and they don't have effective use of the stretch shortening cycle, especially in the specific force orientation involved in change of direction, what we see is that they get much more fatigued, much more sore, and they take longer to recover because they haven't developed that specific capacity. And you can have all of the general aerobic development you want. You have to put it in that context. And this is something I started last year with my football guy who was coming off an ACL injury from a couple of years ago. So he was coming off an ACL injury. We were working all these change of direction things. We're getting him strong. We're getting him to absorb force. We're getting him to do all the things you want to do post-op ACL. And then it dawned on me one day, like, he's going to go back to camp, and the number one thing I need him to be able to do is repeat these outputs, because it's going to be 100 degrees and he's going to be asked to take play after play after play. And then when he gets on the field, he needs to be able to execute play after play after play, because the thing that I don't want is for his motor outputs to change to such a degree that he falls back into compensatory strategies that might predispose his ACL to stresses that we don't want it under. So what we would literally do is have him work specific linebacker drills that we knew he would see in camp, as well as like one-on-one coverage situations with our coaches and PTs. Now, again, we're not like the best athletes in the world, but like it was allowing him to work on the repeated output of having to A, react to a stimulus, B, do a lot of short ground contact cutting and change of direction work to reaccelerate out of those cuts, and then to have to do that over and over again. So we would do like 6 to 10 plays, and then with like interspersed with like 40 to 45 seconds rest, something that you would see with like a fast up-tempo offense in the NFL these days. And then we would give him like a 3 to 5 minute rest, like a full recovery, and then we would do another series, right? And this is after we built the general qualities of aerobic development, like mitochondrial density, capillarization, just general efficiency of the heart to be able to supply blood, all of that stuff. But when it came time for the summer, like June, July, and camp was around the corner, we transferred to specific application of drills that as closely resemble the change of direction demands of his sport and his practice as possible, so that when he goes back, he has already done those repeated outputs and he's resistant to fatigue. And so, yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, that the ability to change levels, the ability to rotate, the ability to apply horizontal forces, the ability to deform and yield is going to change in the face of fatigue. And you might get athletes who in the first quarter can do a great job of getting that force orientation and checking all those boxes. But by quarter three, maybe their brain intrinsically knows, if I yield and I deform and I lower my center of gravity in this cut, I don't have the force production anymore, because I don't have enough O2 getting to the system, or I don't have enough fresh blood flow, or I am too O2 depleted right now, and I can't get out of it because I can't produce the force necessary. So instead of changing levels, they stick that leg out there with a really hard stop. And maybe now you're getting a situation where you have a non-contact ACL, or you have a non-contact injury throughout the chain, simply because their body knew, if I go down there, I'm not coming back out because I'm too fatigued.
How do you, let's take the cut, for example, whether it's, 180 or 90 as a baseline. If someone comes to you and they essentially have no mechanical ability to even position themselves properly to do a cut, how do you go about teaching someone like the step-by-step process of teaching them how to do that properly?
Yeah, so this is where the assessment comes in big time, right? So I need to know whether they even have the ability to get in that position to start with. And so if we look at a squat, right? Because a squat is a decent representation of the ability to change levels and what your strategy is for changing levels. So if you come in and you go to do a body weight squat with your toes facing straight ahead as an assessment, if you are unable to even reach parallel without your hips shooting backwards, right, or getting like a big butt wink, posterior orientation of the pelvis and lumbar flexion, then what you're telling me is you're going to run out of room very quickly, and you're probably lacking the relative motions within the pelvis to be able to change levels. And then I can back that up with my table test, right? So I'll look at hip internal rotation, because hip internal rotation at 90 degrees is going to tell me about your ability to expand the pelvis anteriorly and expand the lower posterior pelvis. So if you think about the arc of hip flexion, this is kind of a new concept. And again, all credit goes to Bill Hartman for teaching this. But as you pass through, if you start in like full hip extension and then you go to 60 degrees, that is an inhalation, external rotation biased position, right? As I pass from 60 to 120 degrees, the musculature that we think of as external rotation musculature, such as like glute max, piriformis, the superior fibers of glute max and piriformis actually become internal rotators from 60 to 120 degrees of hip flexion. And so that arc of hip flexion is biased towards internal rotation. In order to authentically internally rotate, I need sacral nutation, I need ilial internal rotation, and I need to be able to expand the pelvis to a certain level to be able to push the volume of my guts down enough to get into that position. If I can't do that, then I'm going to have to compensate. And that's where people will run out of room, they'll fall over backwards, etc. So I'm always testing range of motion on the table to see if they even have the capability to get there. And for example, when that kid, the dangerous one that I mentioned, first came to me, even as a 13-year-old kid, he had about 3 degrees bilaterally of hip internal rotation. And he was literally so anteriorly oriented and his thorax was tilted over so much backwards that before he even reached like 60 degrees of hip flexion, he was starting to kick his hips back. It was like he was running into a wall because his pelvic diaphragm is overcoming and concentric to such a degree that he cannot push fluid volume down into his pelvis at all. And so the only place for him to go is backwards. And so he's about to fall over backwards before he even hits that. That's somebody who in a 180-degree cut where we know contact times are longer and deformation is greater to allow me to dissipate those forces, that is someone who's going to struggle in that kind of cut. Now, he doesn't necessarily need to do that a lot because he's a baseball player. That being said, you better have some hip internal rotation if you want to be effective at throwing and hitting baseball, right? And being able to cut and change direction. So that the mechanics and the movement have been something we've worked on to restore his variability through the skeleton to allow him to get in better positions. Because like I can't coach him to be more effective there if the range of motion is not there and he's that restricted. And we used to do like, some reactive 3-cone stack drills from Lee Taft. And I would watch him try to get to the ground and pick up the cone. And his shoulders would actually end up below his hips because he would literally hit the stop point on his way down. And the only way to get to the ground is to reach over and bend over and grab it. Incredibly inefficient, right? But that's what he had available to him. So first bucket is I got to make sure the position's there that I can even start coaching, right? And then over time, and this kind of comes to another question about, how do I program? So I take like a whole approach to my speed and agility program. A lot of people, as I said before, will go through this very progressed nature of like, you have to check this box, then this box, then this box, and then we get to actually changing directions. I actually invert that. And again, this is Lee Taft all day. So we start with the full skill. If I want to see them do a 90-degree cut, I'm going to do some sort of drill where we're doing a 90-degree cut or a reactive drill or competitive drill where they have to do a 90-degree cut at high velocities in a reactive or competitive environment. I will then look at the mechanics, right? And I will look at what they're doing and figure out, are there any inefficiencies or issues popping up that I then need to address? And if I see that, I'll pull them out of the reactive drill and I'll either use a regression or I'll use a part drill, right? So let's just use, for example, maybe they're not changing levels and getting in the tunnel, as we'd say, enough in their change of direction. And maybe their plant angles are poor, right? So maybe I want to work on a drill that's going to force them to self-organize a more effective plant angle and teach them that. So I might use a low box side run where they have 1 foot on the low box, 1 foot off the low box. I have a light band pulling them in the direction of the cut, and they're going to jump from one side of the box to the other and switch the foot that's on the box and then immediately jump back. So it's simulating a low velocity, low force, low amplitude cut, and the band is just providing a little bit more momentum into the cut. So what they begin to figure out is if they don't create a wide plant angle and create enough stiffness and stay in the tunnel enough to be able to create that horizontal force production we talked about, then I literally pull them over and they get stuck in the cut. And I'm like, don't let me do that. Like, don't let me win. And all of a sudden now they have this really crisp, very fast, elastic cut where their foot is outside of their base of support. They get stiff at the right time and they get back to the other side of the box really quickly. And I'm like, perfect. That's what I wanted to see. Now let's go hit our 90-degree cut again. And then I put them back into the whole drill or the reactive drill or the competitive drill. And I have them execute with that new understanding of body position and execution. So it's like a sandwich, as opposed to going through this progression. I literally start with what I want to see, And then I break out the specific drills that are needed to improve the individual's abilities from there, because we don't have to take them from square one. There's probably a lot of things they're already doing well, right? It's about identifying the biggest rocks for improvement. And so, maybe I need to teach them to change levels. Maybe they have the range of motion. So let's actually take the opposite problem. Somebody comes in, they have all the range of motion in the world at their hips, right? This is somebody who's typically more of like a narrow infrasternal angled individual, a low pressure strategy. So this person, you ask them to squat and they just like bottom out the deepest squat imaginable and they sit there like all day, super comfortable. But they're going to be poor potentially at producing force and overcoming actions. So you might see somebody like that who can't change levels because intrinsically their brain knows, if I enter this cut at a high velocity and with high forces and I try to lower my center of gravity, I can't get back out. And so, like, again, not to stereotype, but these are some of your like female athletes who are longer, narrower, taller, right? And you see them try to cut and they get this big valgus moment at their knee, right? And they don't want to actually bend and change levels because I think intrinsically their brain knows, I can't create an overcoming contraction to get out of the cut and to change my momentum and to manage my internal forces against gravity. And so they become very stiff at ground contact. They don't deform at all. That puts their soft tissues at potential risk and is very inefficient. So maybe I actually need to do some strength training with that individual to teach them the overcoming action to stiffen some of their tissues and to give them the ability to actually absorb force throughout the system, and then to use that force and that elastic energy to produce something coming out of the cut. So it's all about identifying what skills you need to see, understanding what ranges of motion will be necessary for them to achieve the position that you need. What are the minimum ranges of motion you need? And then from there, figuring out, is this an issue of force production? Is this an issue of range of motion? Is it an issue of skill acquisition? Or maybe they crush all those things. And then could it be an issue of capacity? Because sometimes these things only pop up when they're fatigued.
I want to shift back to the PRI and the respiration piece. How do you integrate all those ideas of axial skeleton position and breathing into a performance setting without kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and spending an hour lying on your back?
100%. And so this is a great question. And I think the first thing we have to realize is that we don't exist or work on lever systems. This is a big point, right? A lever requires a fulcrum, requires those two pieces to touch at the fulcrum, right? Fulcrums do not exist in the human body because none of our bones touch. There is space at every joint, and that space is preserved. If you do not have space in your joints, you have problems, right? Like that is more like where you get a joint replacement, right? And you have problems there. So we don't work on levers. So we're essentially a tensegrity system filled with gas and fluid, and we move on the movement of volume and pressure throughout that system, right? So when we appreciate that, then we start to look at, okay, well, what things move volume and pressure and fluids and gases more than anything else? And it's respiration, 100%, right? That is why so many functions of our body are entrained to respiration, because it allows us to oscillate these things so well, like our lymph fluid, right? Blood flow, fluctuations in cerebral spinal fluid. If you watch the heart and the breath, and you see some of these techniques that they're using in Stanford to image the brain now, you can actually see the brain oscillate with every heartbeat and every breath. It's the coolest thing in the world. But like that is how our body functions, and it happens head to toe. Now, the cool part about being bipedal is we don't have to entrain our locomotor system and our respiratory system together. A lot of high level athletes do, especially endurance athletes. They show certain entrainment kind of qualities with the breath and with their movement. But we don't have to, right? Quadrupeds and other animals do, because they're a little bit more locked into that. But what we have to appreciate is that as I move, my only strategies for movement through space, because of that fact that I'm a tensegrity system filled with gas and fluid, is compression or expansion. That is how I move. And that is how I move through gait. That's how I change directions. That's how I jump and leave the ground. That's how I manage gravity, through compression and expansion, right? And so I'm going to breathe no matter what, right? I'm going to find a way to continue to breathe. And so inhalation is expansion. Your entire system has to expand to inhale. from all the way from your cranium down to your feet. Same thing with exhalation. Exhalation is compression. I need to be able to compress the system to exhale all the way from top to bottom. Exhalation is going to be an internal rotation compression strategy. Inhalation is external rotation and expansion. Now, here's the problem. If I don't have respiratory variability, which means I can't move the entire axial skeleton and the entire skeleton for that matter through a full excursion of respiration, then I'm going to have to find a way to inhale and exhale because I still got to breathe. So what am I going to do? I'm going to start using compensatory strategies, right? So I still get to breathe, but now I'm not excursioning through a full range of motion. So as we begin to layer on some of these compensatory strategies of compression and expansion in different areas of the axial skeleton to continue to permit respiration, I lose range of motion. So just for example, if I can't expand the dorsal rostral or upper posterior thorax, I am going to lose external rotation due to the position of the scapula on that compressed thorax, the shifting of fluid volume in the joint, and the concentric orientation of internal rotation musculature that I'll pick up, which shifts fluid posteriorly and restricts my ability to ER. Okay. The further I go into these compensations and the more things that I compress, the more range of motion I lose. So when I'm looking at range of motion, I have an eye for where do I need to create compression? Where do I need to create expansion to restore enough motion to allow this athlete to perform? So as I said with that kid Kevin, who's a baseball player, like that 3 degrees of hip internal rotation bilaterally is a constraint to his performance and something that could be deleterious to his health long term. So I have taken that as a priority, right? Now, how do I integrate this into a training session? Number one, with private clients that work with me one-on-one, I'm going to do 1 to 3 breathing based, probably lower level based kind of activities at the beginning of the session to allow them to recapture some of this range of motion and some of these expansive qualities they need to move effectively, right? And so 1 to 3 of those activities is plenty. I will progress it from like lower level, ground based, more static to more upright against gravity dynamic activities that get them to challenge their ability to expand while up against other demands, right? But many of the people that I work with are either like athletes, like I mentioned, or Gen Pop who either were in pain, still are in pain, are working with PT. So like that's a focus of mine as well, is to make sure that I can continue to recapture these motions so that we can distribute stress more effectively and move more effectively. So that's like the first piece of it. From there, in my warm up, I'm always going to prioritize these alternating based activities. So lots of cross connecting lunges, lots of lateral split squats, lots of bear crawls and crab walks. Sometimes I'll throw in arm bars for different activities. I've been using a lot of rolling recently, thanks to one of Bill's former students and a friend of mine, Mike Camperini, using like a rock and roll, using tumbling and different gymnastic activities, using log rolling to use the force of the ground and the roll to actually reshape the axial skeleton. A lot of people don't realize this, but bones bend, they compress, they elongate, they move, they change shape over time and subjected to forces. So if you have a certain shape, if you're a wider person like I am, compressed front to back, you're going to lose many ranges of motion. You'll be good at really at many things, but one of them is not moving particularly well. So sometimes you actually have to change the shape of the skeleton to allow you to recapture some of these ranges of motion. So we use a lot of rolling and gymnastic activities, especially with young kids. Those are fantastic for working with young kids. I think like Jeremy Frisch does the best job of this in the industry, like watching him just do all this tumbling and rolling and crawling and all of that stuff with young kids that is very gymnastic-esque, getting them to manipulate their body and get upside down. That stuff has so much value. So we'll use that even with my adult clients. And then, as I said, we'll build from static to dynamic, low velocity to high velocity, ground-based to standing through the developmental sequence. And then once I get to my strength training piece of things, right, I am appreciating that maybe I do want to or need to do some sort of like bilateral lifting to help them achieve their goals, right? But bilateral lifting comes at a cost, right? It is a compressive strategy. It involves both limbs being in contact with the floor of the bar at the same time, which is automatically going to bias me towards this more symmetrical position of compression that is done on an asymmetrical system that is meant to function in more of a one side of, at a time kind of system. And so maybe if that's my primary lift, or I need that to develop something for this athlete or client, my secondary work, my accessory work, is going to be more biased towards maintaining and restoring the axial skeleton variability and the respiratory variability that this individual needs to stay healthy, or in Kev's case, to achieve better performance, to open up some of that internal rotation, both at his shoulder and his hips. So this is where, instead of doing a deadlift as my primary lift and then an RDL as my secondary lift and a squat as my tertiary lift, maybe it's I do my trap bar deadlift, but my accessory lift is something like a goblet front foot elevated split squat or a Camporini deadlift paired with some sort of ab based activity that's going to get him anterior core musculature and excursing his limbs while maintaining that position. Maybe it's going to be combining that with some sort of chop or lift variation or a unilateral press. So, or maybe at the end, I'll do some sort of sled dragging in a Zercher position with the sled getting pulled forward. And immediately that opens up my upper back because I'm in a position where I'm creating expansion in the posterior thorax as I do my sled drag. Maybe that's on my upper day, as I said, using arm bars and get up variations where I can move the humerus through a full excursion of compression and expansion, inhalation, exhalation, and recapture some of these ranges of motion. So I think it doesn't have to take over the session in terms of doing all this ground-based breathing stuff. Sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes you need that to recapture range. But I also think that we can appreciate that if we embed some of these principles into our movement prep and our accessory work, then we can still do a lot of really good, hard, challenging work that is weight room and performance based while still actually getting a lot of benefit in terms of recapturing these things. And one last kind of example of that is I have a golfer I'm working with right now. And, he's more of a golfer for fun. He's a Gen Pop client. He's a CEO, like just loves golf, but has a history of chronic back pain and knee problems. So he's working with me now. And he's as stiff as it comes, right? If you look at his rib cage is this wide down below, and then it narrows coming up to the top. So he literally looks like a pyramid, basically. Compressed up top, all that stuff. And his coach wants him to be able to keep his left shoulder down as he goes through his backswing, right? His left shoulder rises up too much, and that's a technical flaw that they want to correct. And so I was watching his swing the other day, and I'm like, like I think I can see what the problem is. His scap, he is unable to horizontally adduct his shoulder and internally rotate his humerus on the left. So he can't bring his left arm across his body anymore to get the club back in position. So what does he do? He extends his left lower back and he elevates his scap like he's shrugging as he comes across his body. Boom, there's his left shoulder coming up way too high in that position, right? So what do we do instead? And we do a couple breathing activities at the beginning, but instead of spending the whole session on his back, because he does need to train, he needs to lose a little weight as well, we embedded some of those movement principles and breathing principles into an arm bar in his accessory work to be able to get a little bit more pump handle expansion in his left chest wall, which will allow him to recapture some internal rotation. And now all of a sudden he doesn't have to extend his back as much. He doesn't have to elevate his shoulder as much. His neck tension decreases, his low back tension and SI pain on the left decrease, and he's able to get into a better position for his golf swing. So we're still training, but now we're embedding those principles within a training element that is performance oriented.
Man, that's been absolutely great. I have two more questions for you before you get off the call. 60 seconds for most influential books. Go.
Okay. So most influential books: Behave by Robert Sapolsky. Why Sleepers Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky as well. Two of my absolute favorites. I would say Super Training is a great read. There's an incredible amount of stuff in there that I think a lot of young coaches need to go back to, but we look at that as like the Bible. And most people don't read it. Like, go read it. It's all in there. It's all been done before. And then I would say the last one would be, that's a tough one. The Power of Habit. There you go.
All right, so that's four good ones for everybody to dive into. What about most influential coaches for you?
Number one has to be Bill Hartman. I really can't thank that man enough for everything he's done from a mentorship perspective and a teaching perspective with me. I wouldn't be where I am without him. Ty Terrell is another huge one. As I said, protege of both Bill, Mike Robertson, and Lee Taft. I gained so much just from learning from him. I would say John Hudak was a personal mentor to me, especially in the speed and agility field. He was another lead TAF guy, but he worked with me at Parabolic, so he was huge. Joe Myron, as I mentioned before, from a PT perspective, but also one of the most brilliant performance minds that nobody knows about. And then overall, like, can't fail to mention Lee Taft, because in terms of speed, agility, and change of direction, as well as working with young athletes, there is nobody better in the world. And so there are a lot of other people out there that I didn't mention, but I would say those people have had just such a huge influence on me as a coach, a professional, a communicator. And I'll throw one more in there, Mike Baker, who again, like, owns Bolt Fitness in New Jersey. A lot of people do know him, a lot of people don't know him, but like, he took me from a guy who hated business, hated everything about business, didn't want to talk about sales at all, and showed me that business is nothing more than relationships and communication and coaching. And that was like, I still remember exactly where I was when we had that conversation. And so he has been such a huge mentor and a guide to me, especially in like the communication, the coaching, and the sales element. It's just made me such a more well-rounded professional, and I can't thank him enough either.
Where can people find out more about you on social media?
So I'm most active on Instagram. JMSB underscore strength training is my Instagram handle. I'm on Facebook quite a bit. I'll post everything I post on Instagram on Facebook, and I'll interact as much as I can there. My name is Justin Moore. You'll find me there. Unfortunately, there's a country singer named Justin Moore, so you might have to dig a little bit. But Facebook and Instagram are where I'm most active. I have a blog. I wrote a really extensive blog article one time and then haven't written since. And I have a couple friends who are always trying to get me to write more on that. So I'm going to try to be more active there. But yeah, Instagram is really where you're going to find most of my stuff. And then if you look at the Rebel Performance website, I don't think Dark Side Strength is up there anymore, but I had a number of articles up there one time. So between Rebel Performance, Michelle Boland's website and her resource roadmap has a lot of like my contributions in it as well. And you'll find a few articles in both of those locations that you can check out.
Fantastic. I'll link those in the description of the show. Thanks so much for coming on, man, today.
Oh, thanks for having me, man. This was great. I love talking shop, and look forward to doing it again sometime.
Sounds good. Take care.
All right, see you, buddy.